psychological abuse starts to take place first. And then it gradually, systemically builds on top of each other. Ridiculing, threatening, put downs, name calling, all these things are conducive to what verbal abuse is and mental abuse is.
Hi, I'm Kira Yakubov, licensed marriage and family therapist and founder of Heal Your Roots Wellness Practice. Every episode, we talk with a professional from the mental health field to learn more about their approaches and specialties, and also their journey of becoming a therapist. In this podcast, we'll uncover a deeper look at the world of therapy from new perspectives. You'll meet the therapists of Heal Your Roots Wellness Practice and trusted colleagues from the community tackling mental well-being. We're your go-to network for practical and professional insight in mental health. Subscribe for new episode releases every other Wednesday.
Hello, I'd like to welcome today's guest, Dr. Michele Finneran, a licensed professional counselor and private practice owner of Beck & Associates located in Florida. Michele is also the author of Surviving Domestic Abuse, Formal and Informal Supports and Services, and I have the phenomenal book right here. Michele, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kira. I really appreciate being here. Thank you so much for having me again.
Absolutely. So we always start these episodes with really learning more about our guests and their background. So if you can kind of share a little bit about your story and your journey of becoming a therapist and why you got into the mental health field, that would be phenomenal.
Sure. I started in the mental health field relatively early on in my life. I was about 18, 19 years old, where I started working as a mental health tech in the field. And what I realized early on, particularly when I went to my undergraduate work at Stetson University in DeLand, Florida, is I learned that I became really, really good with the classes and also with the people when I worked for internship at a crisis stabilization unit. And it was really, really significant for me to understand that this is where I fit in and how I was able to help people. Now, I knew really early on in my childhood, unconsciously, I think, when my dad kind of opened up to me very early on at a young age, it really disclosed a lot of his family traumas on to me early on in my life. So I always never was a huge mistake or a misunderstanding as to why I went in the mental health field or why I chose conflict resolution for my PhD.
Okay, so a lot of great experience, but also I feel like a lot of therapists, there's something within our families, our own personal experiences that kind of inform that decision down the line.
Absolutely. And, it was a very unconscious decision. And I felt so bad for my father when he was going through this, as he was processing this with me at too early of an age. But I also felt that I wanted to have empathy for him and help him, but I just was too young in which to do so therapeutically. So
sure. And if you could share a little bit about your practice in Florida and, your PhD program and everything, because I know you have a lot of expertise and experience in the field, so that the listeners can kind of get more background that way before we dive into the book you wrote.
Sure. So the PhD is actually in conflict resolution and dispute analysis from Nova Southeastern University. I also have a license to treat of the state of Florida. I have a master's and a licensed mental health counselor. And I have a practice located in Coral Springs, Florida, called Beck & Associates. And basically I'm dealing with a lot of people that are first responders. I deal with a lot of nurses. I deal with a lot of law enforcement. I deal with a lot of firefighters. And I deal with a lot of marriages and families as well. So post-pandemic, what I've been noticing is a lot of marriages and families really needed some support and some help. So I've been spearheading kind of that along the way.
It's been a lot coming through, especially with relationships during the pandemic, everyone kind of being home and stuck together, right? And all these other dynamics that might have been, hidden or not as noticed really coming to the forefront. And you work with a lot of people who are constantly dealing with traumatic experiences and the crises.
Absolutely. And one of the rises during the pandemic was there's three major rises. I don't know if you recognized as curious as a licensed professional, there was a rise in suicide, there was a rise in substance abuse, and there was a rise in domestic abuse. And domestic
Yeah.
abuse book that I wrote talks a little bit about how to help professionals and non-professionals, family members and friends, help survivors of domestic abuse really come forward and helping them in the most effective ways.
Yeah, that's really powerful work. I mean, I commend you for this book. It's very comprehensive. It covered a lot of information that I was surprised to see in so many different ways. It was very valuable.
Thank you so much. It was a very interesting research. It was actually an honor to do research like this and to interview. What I did is I interviewed several survivors of domestic abuse, and I interviewed them in a way that was a qualitative study. So I was able to ask open-ended questions and sub-questions to ask so I can better get an understanding. And then what I would do with the data is I analyze the data. And then when there's a saturation in data, meaning you're seeing the same things over and over again, that becomes the theme.
Sure. Is this kind of the reason why you wrote the book? Is that you were starting to see it through the pandemic and that was a big thing that was coming up for your clients? Or was there kind of a different reason, if you feel comfortable sharing, why that was something you went into specifically to research?
Absolutely. So the reason why I actually chose this research topic is when I was in my PhD program, I was working for a local jail, and I realized that the system has been and is extremely flawed. And what I was noticing when I was doing my group sessions with my with female incarcerated inmates is a lot of these inmates that were incarcerated for domestic abuse, for defending themselves in a domestic abuse situation. And so I thought this was kind of twisted, and I was kind of baffled and didn't really understand what was happening until I talked to my PhD chair, and she's like, well, absolutely. I'm like, is this a real thing? Like, is this a real thing that people that try to stand up for themselves, they actually get arrested and they try to like defend themselves? And she's like, yeah, that actually does happen. So what I started doing is I got this research study, and she's like, look at the data, look at the research and see if there's holes and gaps in the data. And what I realized in the data when I researched the research that was not been done in this field is there wasn't a whole lot of information about what kind of supports to help survivors or victims of domestic abuse. So that's why I decided to interview survivors that had been through the system, that had been through a year out of a domestic violence relationship, what that would have been like, where they used formal and informal supports, and how effective they were or not.
Wow. So you're doing really powerful, significant work to help so many people. And I know in this book specifically, you focus on women. So just being able to help so many women find these supports and help their family members, but also like legal advice, the law enforcement. Like, I really love that you took a very like holistic look of everything, like the whole system of how can they be helped, in what ways, and kind of demystifying some of these myths that people might think are like what comes up for domestic abuse victims and everything.
Correct. Thank you. I found that the women that I interviewed, the survivors that I interviewed, had a comprehensive array of formal and informal supports that they use that I was able to capitalize on.
Yeah. And so for the listeners, can you share a little bit of maybe the definition of domestic abuse and what that looks like? Because I know in your book you even share how it's a lot of people or a lot of women don't seek help because they don't even recognize that they're in an abusive relationship.
Right. They don't realize that they realize that something is wrong. They do realize that something is wrong, but they don't understand or can wrap their head around that it's actually defined as domestic abuse. And so what they realize is something is wrong, and the only ways that they realize that what it really is they do their own type of research, or they talk to other people, which is hard to do when a perpetrator isolates you from your family and friends to do that. But that's typically what happens. So domestic abuse is an array of different types of abuses. It can stem from mental and emotional and psychological abuse. It can range from physical abuse and physical violence, and then there's sexual abuse. Those are the three most common types of abuse. But there's also other types of abuse that people don't get into. And on my platforms this month, I talk a little bit about financial abuse and what that looks like in a domestic violence relationship. And so that financial abuse keeps the victim and perpetrator stapled in the relationship, as well as a couple psychological, traumatic, emotional bonding that takes place between the perpetrator and the victim that keeps people stapled in their dynamic. So those things, and then there could be religious abuse. There could be different spheres, using children as a tool, type of abuse. Then with that there could be child abuse, all kinds of things kind of morphing into each other when it comes to domestic abuse. It's not just one broad definition.
Sure. And I think maybe the common one, or maybe that we see in movies, is physical abuse. That's like you can see it. It's very tangible. There's marks and everything. But I don't think it's as commonly talked about the mental or psychological, emotional, or the financial abuse that people don't really see from the outside. But the victim is experiencing it and feeling it. And it's kind of like a slow drip, right? It's not just boom, it's in your face, because I think that would be easier to identify versus this is gradually happening over time to somebody.
Exactly. My dissertation chair, when she said, domestic abuse doesn't happen when one day you wake up and your partner punches you. That does not happen like that. It's a gradual building block of things that happen over time, over things that happen to get you to a place where one day you're waking up and it's at a place that you never thought it would be. And so what social media portrays is something that's really not equivalent to what really goes on in the home. Social media portrays that there has to be some sort of bloodshed or some sort of punching or some sort of physical strangulation of some sort. And that always ends up that way. What it starts up happening is psychological abuse starts to take place first. And then it gradually, systemically builds on top of each other. Ridiculing, threatening, put downs, name calling, all these things are conducive to what verbal abuse is and mental abuse is, making the victim feel less than, examples like that.
And so it sounds like, as I was reading through this book, is that the common theme is that this feeling of powerlessness and not being able to trust ourselves and being able to kind of recognize these things, because whether it's we've experienced it in the past or some of these beliefs and narratives we've had about ourselves, and then meeting this person who is kind of reinforcing these beliefs, or like you're saying, ridiculing and making us believe a certain way about ourselves.
Right. A lot of the perpetrators actually try to make the victim feel like they're crazy, like there's something severely wrong with them when they're not crazy. Women have an instinctual gut feeling, particularly women that are mothers. They have a gut feeling, an instinctual feeling that they know that something is not right. And so what they do is they do their own kind of research. And that's what the survivors that I researched, they started reaching out to podcasts. They started reaching out to support groups online, and they started reaching out to different places where they heard similar stories, and they were like, oh my gosh, it sounds so similar to what I'm going through. And they began to realize that this is an actually bigger thing than what I anticipated.
Yeah. And so it sounds like even that process is pretty long, right? Like first just kind of recognizing and coming to terms with, this is not healthy. This is not a safe place for me. But then I know reading through the book, it was saying, there's like a level of embarrassment or humiliation being able to share this with our family or friends and feeling misunderstood, or if there's law enforcement called, like a lot of these interactions make them feel even less safe to express what's going on for them.
More isolated, more alienated, more alone. And the message, if any message that I bring out forward in this podcast, is that you're not alone. You're never alone. There's somebody that has you have, and that's why it's so important to like be careful when you're in small circles about what you talk about, because why don't you just leave is a common kind
Yeah.
of question that we ask victims, which is a very unfair, unjustified question to ask a victim who's going through a domestic violence situation. If it was that easy, then you'd leave. But it's
Sure.
very complex. It's very complex on so many spheres and so many levels that it makes it hard to make that break. And it takes about 9 times in which to do so.
Wow, 9 times.
9
Wow.
times statistically, yeah.
That's crazy. And so would you be able to share a little bit, because I know that you explain Stockholm Syndrome and how that comes up in that trauma bonding that might look strange from the outside looking in to someone who is experiencing domestic abuse, to feel so close or connected or almost defend their abuser in that way.
So one of the things that I've learned is going for law enforcement, going to a domestic violence call is probably one of the most dangerous calls to go on, because they don't know the unpredictability of what they're going to end up seeing at the scene. So what usually ends up happening is sometimes in these situations is the victim calls for help and intervention. A police officer comes out and interviews both the victim and the perpetrator, and go to arrest the perpetrator for either marks. It's hard. You can't arrest, a law enforcement officer can't arrest based on psychological abuse or mental abuse. So that's why physical marks or markings on the body will equate to some sort of arrest. And so what happens is law enforcement will end up arresting the perpetrator, and then the victim gets upset that their perpetrator is getting arrested, and then they try to like jump on the back of the police officer.
Wow.
And start to like get physical with the police officer. So there's this big, and this is just kind of like the vicious kind of cycle that goes on when you talk about trauma bonding.
Yeah.
So this is the biggest traumatic situation when it comes to trauma bonding, is when the victim feels traumatized by the trauma that they've experienced, and so much traumatized, but also protective of their perpetrator, where they lash out at someone who they call to defend them.
Yeah. And so can you explain a little bit this phenomena of Stockholm Syndrome for listeners who may not understand or may have only seen it on movies or like hostage situations, how this really is a good analogy, or what's happening for a victim during those times?
Absolutely. The Stockholm Syndrome is usually a typically coined term used to discuss a hostage situation, a hostee and a hostage situation. What I did is I paralleled it with perpetrators and domestic violence victims. And what I did was because it's very similar in terms of behavior, character traits that a perpetrator or hostage does over their victim. And so what I began realizing is there becomes something called trauma bonding, which makes it so difficult for the victim to actually leave, because it's like they have this kind of connection, emotional connection with their perpetrator that they cannot break away from. As much as he is hurt, as much as he trespassed, as much as he's tried to put down or emotionally and physically beat up, there's still this connectivity that the victim and perpetrator have. And we see the cycle of violence where there's abuse that happens, and then there's a honeymoon phase, and then there's the escalation that builds, and this vicious cycle kind of goes round and round and round. And that's what keeps them kind of stapled in this situation. So the Stockholm Syndrome was a term coined based out of Stockholm, Sweden, where a hostage and a hostage situation took place at a bank, where a bank robber took over 3 hostages. And so what happened is they began to form a bond, and the people that were hostages began to feel sorry and felt bad and started protecting the person that their perpetrator. And so we see that in this parallel to domestic violence victims and their perpetrators.
So interesting. Do you think that has anything to do with, so I know there's fight, freeze, fawn. Do you think that's maybe part of the fawn? Like our nervous system is trying to protect ourselves, and the best way we know is kind of to please or to rationalize what's going on to make it feel safer or make it feel like we have some sense of control?
Absolutely, it does. Because a victim feels so out of control, they want to feel like they control something.
Yeah.
And so they use this scenario where they hold on to anything that they can feel like there's a sense of control, like ownership, power, that they've been really identifiably stripped of.
Yeah. So it almost sounds in a counterintuitive way as a survival mechanism for them to be able to move through this experience. If they can't physically leave it, how can I move through it in the ways that I can in this moment internally? And so that is bonding with the perpetrator.
Yes.
Well,
yes. It is a survival. You're absolutely right, Kira. It is a survival mechanism. It's a crisis baseline survival mechanism. Yes.
And so can you share a little bit some of the ways that at least some of the women that you have interviewed, how they have tried to reach out to their family or friends, or how some of their family and friends have attempted to support them in the ways that they know that may have not been effective or detrimental?
Yes. So when reached out to their, per se, their parents, the women, the victims, a lot of parents, what they ended up doing is they ended up bashing or berating the perpetrator, which in itself is not helpful at all for the victim, because what it does is just makes them feel like they've stapled their decision, their wrong decision, into finding a person that was not the right fit for them. And so you would think that a parent would, you think that would be helpful for a victim to hear a parent bash and put down their perpetrator, which actually is counteractive. It's counterintuitive. It actually does the opposite of that. So it's definitely not helpful. So if your daughter comes to you and you're a parent, the last thing you want to do is try to berate, put down the perpetrator, and just try to be as emotionally available and open and non-judgmental as possible for the victim/daughter. What happens is that mother-daughter relationship, especially when the daughter comes to the mother, and we'll talk more a little bit about that relationship, how important that mother-daughter relationship is, and being emotionally available and that attachment there is indicative to why sometimes women that don't have that kind of relationship seek out unconsciously seek out perpetrators.
So it sounds like while the parents or friends may feel like putting their partner down is a way to show that they don't approve or they don't condone this behavior and that they don't like this person, it does the opposite of make the woman feel like she made a wrong decision, there's something wrong with her, and there's this level of shame, I'm assuming, that's really exacerbated. So it's like, oh, I'm going to double down on my decision or just pull away because this feels more of an attack on my judge of character, who I'm picking, or the decisions I'm making, versus what it has to say about my partner.
Exactly what that is. You nailed it.
Okay. And I feel like that's really important for people to hear that, because it does feel counterintuitive to say that, right? They're not going to want to be like, oh, yeah, sure, this is a fine decision. Like, they want to protect them, and it's kind of going into that their own survival mode of wanting to do anything they can to protect their loved one, but it does the opposite, it sounds like.
Exactly. It does the opposite. And you would think that it wouldn't, but it actually does. So, and with friends, a lot of times, the friends end up hearing the same stories over and over again, and they get super frustrated and upset.
Yeah.
One of the best things that a friend can do, if they can no longer help their friend/victim, is be suggestive and having them have moral supports and go into therapy. That's one of the things that I've noticed that a lot of survivors experience when having their friends help them, is that their friends would suggest them going into therapy, and they did. They listened to their friends and they would go into therapy
Oh,
because
wow.
the friends not being able to help them as much as they wanted to or could, based on not having the professional background that they needed.
So that's pretty significant for people to know, is that even just it's out of our scope, right? Like a lot of people don't know, even a lot of therapists, mental health professionals don't necessarily know the best way to help a victim. But it sounds like getting them the professional help and the expertise is the best way, or is one of the most effective ways.
Right. And people that are specialized in treating survivors or victims, they have a specific type of way where they talk, treat, assess
Yeah.
therapeutically. We had talked about this in my book. It's about how mental health therapists, sometimes we want our clients to be where we want them to be, not necessarily meeting them where they're at.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times when a survivor or victim comes to the therapeutic session, the counselor immediately wants to go right into exit strategy. How do we exit from this relationship, where that might not be where the victim is? Maybe this is for the first time the victim is sharing this and processing it for the first time, and they're not ready to really leave. So it's the therapist meeting the client / victim where they're at in the moment.
Yeah, because I can see that also pushing them away, like telling them what to do or deciding for them that this is the best thing right now, again, takes away their power and autonomy to figure it out or to make a decision on their own. It sounds like a lot of the advice that victims get is, we know better, and so you should do this now, which it sounds like almost re-traumatizes or kind of confirms I'm powerless. I don't know what to do. I can't trust myself in making decisions.
Right. It definitely re-victimizes the victim.
And so reading through your book, I saw that some of the effective ways for therapists or mental health professionals to help is not going straight, like you mentioned, into problem solving or making them leave immediately, and not being too passive, because I saw that is kind of challenging their thinking and letting them process their story first, and then being able to help them find different supports or create a plan when they're ready on their time, because that's going to be the most successful outcome.
Exactly. And processing this story it may take not just maybe just more than one session in which to do. It may take several sessions, depending on the severity of the abuse. So having the therapist allow the victim / client to do that is so imperative and important for the therapeutic process. Because when you're in therapy and you actually open up and process, you're actually hearing yourself talk. And that's very important for a victim to actually listen to themselves talk and hear themselves talk, possibly for the first time. So that's pretty significant. And for a therapist to gauge emotionally and also challenge, they have to have a little bit of challenge along with empathetic response, along with unconditional positive regard, regardless of where the victim / client might be therapeutically or psychologically.
Yeah. So it's really finding a finesse between, and every person's different, right? There's not going to be a formula or one fits all. You have to figure out where they're at, meet them there, and then do that dance with them until, you get them to a place where they're safe and they're more empowered to, it sounds like, leave the situation that they're in.
Exactly. And, I talk about in the book that the theme and the stories may sound similar, but it's still very different. There's no cookie cutter solution to these given testimonies. And so each one is kind of individualized according to the victim.
Yeah. And so I want to go back a little bit to the family dynamics and the friends, right? We kind of talked about what's not effective. Would you be able to share, because I know we mentioned pushing them to, seek professional help. Is there certain ways that friends and family can be supportive and empathetic with their words, how they spend their time with them, and the support that they give that would be helpful for the victim to not feel like they're going to be embarrassed or shamed or they have to isolate?
Yeah, just having more of an open understanding. Obviously, it's painful for a friend or a family member to watch their loved one go through this over and over again. And one of the things that is, I would recommend a friend or a family member not do is ghost your victim slash family slash friend.
Mm-hmm.
However, with that being said, the victim's family and friend can also very much lead to burnout and stress by watching their loved one go through this historically and openly and over and over again.
Yeah.
So it's really important for the friend and family member to take a step back and to kind of regroup and replenish themselves in order to be able to be there for their friend who's a victim. Ghosting them is, again, another form of abandonment, which the victim does not need. But also the victim may not understand what the friend is actually going through, or the family member might be going through, watching her go through all this at this, over and over again. So it's that friend and that family taking a step back and just like regaining their own grounding, and their own type of replenishment, if you will, in order to fill their cup again, so they can be more or less still effective for their friend slash victim.
Yeah. So it sounds like kind of just being there to hear them, to support them empathetically, and to understand what they're going through without necessarily telling them to leave, bashing them, pointing them in the direction of support, but also making sure that they take care of themselves and not get burned out to a point where they no longer want to interact with them. And it sounds like kind of setting those boundaries too. Like, listen, like after all these conversations, it feels repetitive. I feel frustrated. I feel hurt watching you go through this. I have to take a break from talking about this sometimes so I can continue showing up for you when you need me.
Exactly. Exactly.
That can be tough.
It's a really
too.
good encapsulation. Yeah, absolutely. It's very tough to set those boundaries because you don't really want to, but you kind of have to for your own mental health.
Yeah.
It's a really good. So Kira, that's a really good encapsulation of what exactly, like a summarized statement. That's exactly what's happening there.
And so while I was reading your book, it actually kind of surprised me a little bit to learn more about the mother-daughter relationship, to see how that might influence or impact a victim being victimized later on in life, or like how you mentioned sometimes like subconsciously being attracted to an abusive partner. Can you share a little bit more about what that looks like and that important dynamic between a mother and daughter?
So the same-sex parent is always probably a very important parent to identify with and relate to. And what I realized going through the interviews with a lot of these survivors is most of them, all of them, I thought going in, I had my own biases. Obviously, when you do research, you would think that there would be issue with the daughter-father relationship.
That's what I thought.
But it's not. It was always the mother-daughter relationship that was always impaired. Every single woman that I interviewed had a disruptive relationship with their mother. And what I found was in the mother relationship with the daughter, the mother was physically viable for the daughter, tangibly, babysits, can give money, place to live, transportation, childcare, whatever the case may be. What was significant that was not there is the emotional support that the victim actually needed from their mother. And that emotional unavailability and almost narcissistic mother made it prevalent for the daughter to seek out a different type of intimate partner that they weren't finding, that they found that was voided out in their mother-daughter relationship.
That's so fascinating to think about, because I thought the same as you started thinking it might be the relationship with the father or having a controlling, father figure that way. But it sounds like not having that nurturing emotional connection and security as a daughter with your mother is so significant in how you view yourself, how you view other relationships, and what you're looking for when you're dating somebody. So it almost sounds like if they didn't receive the love and security and self-esteem through that parent, they're going to search and work hard to find someone who can provide that. And if we're on the opposite end, if this is a partner who is controlling or manipulative can easily take advantage of someone who may feel that way about themselves or who may be lacking that security and love from their parents or their mother specifically.
Exactly. And so that mother-daughter relationship is so very important to establish. And, you know, a lot of my survivors that I interviewed just did not have that emotional availability available to them in rearing. And they also, many of the victims that were raising up in their households saw their mom as victims as well.
Sure.
So that learned helplessness that they learned from their mother in their own domestic violence situation and abusive relationship was also a learned kind of behavior that was transgressed for the daughter.
And that's really unfortunate because it kind of goes into this generational trauma and abuse, is that what we see and experience in our home is normalized, right? Like even if we go out into the world and recognize that it might not be that way everywhere, it feels normal and it feels acceptable to some degree for us to repeat and to have those beliefs about ourselves or who we align with kind of in our identity within our home.
Exactly. We are creatures of habit. And we are creatures of familiarity. Mm-hmm. And even though it may be dysfunctional, we gravitate to what is familiar. Even though it may be unhealthy, dysfunctional, and wrong, we gravitate to what is familiar. And so that you see that generational cycle of violence and traumatization happen passed down from generation, from woman to woman in the family.
And so it's tough because, you know, the mother was abused, right? Like this is also a victim who this is now being passed on to their daughter. Have you, any of the women that you interviewed, like what that was like if they had children or what that felt like for them to recognize that how much power and responsibility is also on them for their children by seeing them vicariously living through that as well?
Exactly. And so what the daughter had to do with their own children is they had to recognize consciously, a conscious recognition that what they saw in their own family of origin they did not like, and they weren't going to perpetrate it over and over again. So they made a staple and a decision early on in their year raising up that they were not going to do this to their children. And they made when you make a conscious choice, it's something that you disliked for so long in your past. You then make a conscious choice to break that cycle.
And that's pretty powerful. So even if victims who have children leave at a certain point while the kids are still small, or at some point they're able to recognize and see that their mom was powerful and strong enough to exit this situation. So that in itself is also empowering for the children to recognize that you don't have to be a victim. Like you can move through this with the proper support and help, and it has to be a very conscious effort on your part.
Absolutely.
This book was so informative. Thank you for writing this. I mean, reading this was so helpful for me to recognize as a professional, but personally too, like, wow, there were some relationships that I went through that were kind of questionable that I would have never thought about because it didn't look the way it looked on TV or there wasn't violence involved.
That's why women, not to discredit victims and not to discredit their experiences or their narratives, sometimes don't realize that they're in when they're in it, you know. It's when you step out of the situation or out of the relationship that you begin to realize what a toxic situation this might have been for you.
Yeah. It's getting space away from that to kind of be more objective, like take a step back, because when we're in it, right, like that's why therapists can't be a therapist to someone they know, right, like their family or friends, because we're too involved, we're too invested. It's not objective anymore. But when you take a step back and distance yourself from that experience, you can start to look at it a little bit more objectively and like gain a different perspective. And that whole process sounds like grieving within itself to recognize that you've been in this relationship that you didn't even realize was abusive. And now you are, and now you're getting out of it. Like that takes a lot of strength to be able to do that.
Yes. And resiliency.
Absolutely.
I mean, these women all have exhibited the same type of resiliency, that one character trait of resiliency and being able to stand up on their own eventually through formal and informal supports. It was the key for these women getting out of their toxic abusive relationship.
Yeah, it's so powerful. So it sounds like them being able to find their own strength and power and gain control of their own finances, their own situations, make decisions and trust themselves to make these decisions too is really powerful, and have that respect for themselves.
Absolutely. And when they begin to discover something, the biggest beauty of it all is their own self and their own self-love. And that is the biggest love that they can give themselves, that they discover for themselves. And that is self, is a gift and a journey with self that is embarking on a beautiful relationship in its own.
Absolutely. And that stays with you forever, because that's you and yourself. That never goes away.
Never goes away. You'll never, your own loyalty. You're your own best friend. You have to shake yourself, shake your hands with yourself as being a friend and a person of self-compassion and love for your own self.
Well, are there any, for listeners, whether they are recognizing that they might be in an abusive relationship or no, or for, informal supports, are there some resources or things that you'd be able to share for people that they could reach out to, whether it's online or in shelters or anything like that, to help people kind of find this?
Absolutely. What I can do, Kira, is I have a list of national domestic violence resources. It's like a page long. I can email it to you and send it to you so you can put it all within your podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you. That will be really helpful, and I can add that in the show notes for everybody.
Perfect.
So, Michele, can you share what's coming up new for you in your practice?
Well, with the research that what I do with the research, which is with what the PhD is typically for, is I take the research and I use it to use application into my clinical practice. So not only am I a clinician and a practitioner, that I practice mental health and skills and techniques to help decrease mental health symptoms, but I'm also a researcher to kind of research statistics, topics that need to be more researched out. And that's why I decided to just work on my next writing project, is when I realized what some of the things that were going on for first responders, that what they were dealing with compassion fatigue during COVID-19. And so that the research along with the application is what I like to do best.
Awesome. And where can follower or the audience members find you if they want to reach out to you to work with you?
They can reach me on my website. It's www.beckandassociates.com, and there's a tab there that you can that says contact us, and you can contact me directly on there. It goes right to my email.
Perfect. Michele, thank you so much for being a guest today. This was valuable and very insightful information, and I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you, Kira, for inviting me on your wonderful podcast. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for having me.